Okay, it's 2:14, which is kind of an odd number to start, but we have a lot to get through today. So if you haven't filled out the quiz, just try and pay attention, and then you can fill out the quiz during the break. So we're going to get started. Today we're talking about blockchain incentives, crypto economics, and proof of stake. So I'm going to talk about crypto economics and what exactly that is, and Brian will take over with proof of stake. Okay, yeah. Okay, so we're going to set up the primitives. We've talked a lot about hash functions and cryptography, and we're going to set up the primitives again to understand the technological way blockchain prevents attacks. So we talked about attacks last lecture, I believe. So this is just a new light to look at Bitcoin. We have certain properties that we need to exist within Bitcoin. So we're going to take a look at these properties and see how cryptography and hashes and math fit together with the science of human rationale. And we'll use crypto economics to explain how Bitcoin protects against the attacks we learned about. Okay, so cryptography allows us to prove properties about something that happened in the past. Does anybody want to give me an example of how exactly that happens? First of all, do people understand what I mean when cryptography helps us, when I say cryptography helps us prove properties about something that happened in the past? Everyone's asleep today. Can I get a yes? Like, thumbs up if you understand. Okay, somebody who has their thumbs up, want to explain to the rest of the class who's asleep? Okay, you want to explain? I'm just going to pick on you. You want to explain what your impression? Yeah.
Crypto economics.
No, so why does cryptography allow us to prove something about something that happened in the past? Okay, all right, anybody else? Go for it.
When you create a hash of something, only one specific input creates that hash, and so if you have a hash from the past, then you know that the thing that was used to create it happened before.
Yeah, okay, so this is something I want everybody to think about because I'm going to come back and ask you again since everyone's asleep. Okay, and then economics helps us ensure that those desired properties of Bitcoin hold into the future. So we want to incentivize people to do what we'd like them to do. For example, we'd like miners not to selfish mine, like you guys learned last lecture. So if we'd like them to not to selfish mine, we sort of need to align their incentives such that they're not incentivized to selfish mine. Okay, so turn to your partner and discuss for 30 seconds why we depend on cryptography in Bitcoin. Go, discussion time. Think about the properties in Bitcoin that we need cryptography for. So what exactly is it in Bitcoin that we need to preserve things about the past? Okay, so if I bring it back, hopefully everybody got a chance to think about this a little bit. Let's go on to talk about what exactly Bitcoin's desired properties are, and then we can think about how exactly we're going to relate cryptography to this. So immutability, that's something that we desire in the blockchain, right? That's something that Bitcoin provides, that's something that blockchain provides. Why exactly is the blockchain immutable? Somebody want to give me a quick... Have we taught you nothing? Why exactly is the blockchain immutable? Go.
Because each current block has all hashes.
Right, okay, there you go. So new blocks can't be replaced or removed since they're built off of the last block. It's kind of problematic if you can have transactions suddenly disappear, and that's why we have this sort of immutability in the chain. Okay, then the second one, validity. Anybody have a good answer as to why we need to validate transactions? That one should be pretty self-explanatory, hopefully. Yes, okay. So only transactions that fulfill some valid function should get included into the block. And then for transactions, transactions should be able to be processed if they pay a higher fee. So we need to create that sort of marketplace. And that marketplace exists in Bitcoin because if I pay a higher fee, the miner will be more incentivized to include my transaction into their block. So they'll see it, they'll decode it, they'll look at my transaction, they'll be like, okay, well I get to collect this extra transaction fee if I include this person's transaction into my block, and I'm incentivized to do so. Does that make sense? Okay, and then finally, data associated with a given block should be accessible. So remember, the whole point of blockchain is that all of the transactions are transparent, and so any data that we have used to prove that a certain block was valid should be accessible to everybody. Yeah? These are all things that you guys should know, just sort of formalized. Okay, so I don't want to spend too much time on the following problem, but has anybody heard of the Byzantine generals problem? Hands. Cool, okay, a good number. So I don't want to spend too much time on this again, but the Byzantine generals problem is essentially, so imagine you have two countries, and one country is waging war on the other, and currently they have the other country in a siege, right? So that's like the enemy camps around the side, and they're sending messages to each other because they're all around this city, and they're waging siege, and they're sending messages, but they're not sure about whether or not like the messages were uncorrupted since they aren't in the same location. So all of my generals around the city might not be actually getting the message directly from their co-general. The message might have been corrupted. There's some room for corruption there and some room for fault. So the question becomes how exactly we're going to handle that situation. And I'd like to relate that problem that we just talked about with the Byzantine generals problem to this idea of distributed computing. Because the problem that we've really been talking about with blockchain and with Bitcoin is this idea of Byzantine fault tolerance. So to umbrella the rest of our conversation, in distributed computing, we come across imperfect information about failures. So we don't know whether or not some computer has failed, some computer is giving us the correct information, and we need to be able to protect against those sort of situations when one computer is malicious suddenly and is giving us wrong information. How do we agree on all of those things in the middle there? Objectives, spatial distribution, we have good ones and we have malicious actors, and when people try to attack, we have problems, etc. And so how exactly do we come up with a solution? And the solution in blockchain is to have this consensus mechanism where we can recognize that even though there might be malicious actors out there, we have a way to come to agreement such that the malicious actors can't win over the good ones. Does that sort of make sense? Okay, cool. So we could keep going. So now we're going to review a little bit about cryptography. So uses of cryptography, remember this picture. So again, this is how we prove immutability of the blockchain. So hashes allow us to have cryptographic identity. We sign off consistently and authenticate transactions to prove and claim ownership of digital assets. So if we recall from a couple lectures ago, the avalanche effect in hashes helps us defend against attacks. So even the smallest thing changes, we have a wildly different hash, which makes, first of all, our blockchain tamper evident and then eventually immutable. And second of all, it enables proof of work. Okay. So yeah, it enables consistent total ordering, topological sorting, so that we know in what order these blocks were created. Okay, any questions about how we use hashes or the purpose of hashes? I know this is review, but we're going to make use of this as we move forward. Okay, and then to go over signatures, again, we've talked about signatures. Remember, they allow us to provide transaction sender authenticity. So you can make sure that whoever is sending a message, they were actually the person to send the message. And then there's something called non-repudiation, which is essentially after signing something, you can't deny that you signed it. So a given public key will be responsible for all actions taken that were signed by that associated private key. And so you can't have people say like, oh, like I didn't mean to send that transaction, it wasn't me, because it's directly associated with that private key, public key pairing. And whatever happens, everyone sort of agrees that that's set, that's the truth. And so this sort of situation with signatures, in the bigger picture of blockchain and Bitcoin, it helps us ensure data integrity, and it also enables something called slashing. So that's essentially assigning blame, or if I want to assign sort of penalties to some private key, public key pairing for to disincentivize their bad behavior, this is the reason I can do it. It's because everybody has a sort of agreement that anything that's happened that was signed by your private key, you can't really deny happened, right? Okay, any questions about this? Cool, let's keep going. Erasure codes. Does anybody know what erasure codes are? No? Okay. So erasure codes are to do with data availability. So remember that we had said that all the data that was used to prove a block should be made available to everybody. And so one form of attack might involve me sort of hiding the data or only giving you half the data. And if I need 100% of the data in order to prove the validity of some block, you can see how that might be problematic, right? Yeah? So for example, if I require 100% data availability and I have an attacker, like let's say Brian hides some of the data, then the whole thing goes out the window, right? I can't prove anything. So what is desirable here is for us to turn that 100% data availability into a 50% data availability requirement so that even if my transmission channels are corrupted, that's okay. So it prevents data unavailability attacks. Does that idea sit well with everybody? Any questions? Solid. We have taught you some things. Yes, questions, oh dear. Go.
So does that just mean that you're fine not receiving some of the, like, how does it work then if you have a transmission error and you only get 50% of the data, do you still just process it, or what do you do with the missing part?
Right, so the idea is that I can, so it relies on sort of mathematical properties. However, the idea is essentially that I can, some sort of magical mathematical way in order to turn what I usually need 100% for. I can, if I only have 50% of the data, I could still recreate like some sort of valid proof that it had to like have come from. Does this sort of make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's not a super elucidated.
Maybe a little bit, yeah. Like, how can you be more specific though, about the use case of this? Is this about transactions for verifying transactions, or is this for something else? Like, if 50% of the signature of a transaction comes in, does that mean that it's still verified? Or?
Right. So the question was whether or not if I get like 50% of my signature, then that's problematic, right? Is that your question?
Yeah, or just like, you know, what is the specific use case?
Right. Okay. So if I were sort of a miner or like a large entity mining pool, and I wanted to conduct some sort of attack, and I didn't want anybody else to be able to verify that I had cheated in some way, then I wouldn't be able to cheat on my signature because that's just something that, like the signature is short to begin with, and plus the signature is how I represent like any action that I take. So I can't really cheat on the signature. But if, for example, I cheat on a block or something like that, and I don't want to provide full data on how I don't want people to be able to see that I cheated, I might withhold some data from them. Does that make sense? Yeah.
How can you withhold data if you want to mine it? You have to have full.
Go for it.
So the idea is like, if you recall back to Bitcoin about the Merkle tree, or like the Merkle tree and the Merkle roots, you don't have to include some parts of the Merkle tree, but you can still verify that the Merkle root is the correct one. Do you remember that? Like where you can still have blocks that are, I guess, lost. Not blocks, but like certain parts of the tree that are lost. But if you have certain parts of the tree that are able to, I guess, prove the Merkle root, then you're still good. You don't need all of the transactions that provide this Merkle root. You only need the necessary ones that provide this Merkle root. So you can get away with still having like a loss of data, but like that's, I guess, a use case or like an example of how data availability might look.
Okay. I'm going to keep going, but if you have questions or problems with this, come up to talk to us after. Okay, so uses of cryptography, the last one would be time locks. And so time locks are precisely why you can't parallelize mining. So you delay them. The idea is that you delay the miner before they can read the exact value of the transaction fee so that they can't prioritize transactions according to higher fees. And so that's because they'd have to decrypt every single transaction, which would take too much time. So the idea is here, you send C and PQ to a miner, and then the miner takes log n time to retrieve D, which is the transaction. The squaring Euclid's method takes some amount of time. It like has to take some amount of time in order to reconstruct the value D. And so solving this is just time consuming. And this proves that some amount of time must have elapsed between messages A and messages B. And that's sort of the general idea on how exactly mathematically we prove that some time has elapsed between things. Okay, and so again, this is the main takeaway from this would be that parallelization speed up is sort of useless in this scenario. Okay. All right, so this is just a summary. Erasure codes immune to data erasure codes allow us to be immune to data unavailability attacks. Again, we'll talk about that later if you want. Hashes help us provide a topological sorting of the messages. Time lock provide time elapse between messages, and signatures help us prove the identity behind the message. Okay, any questions? Broad overview questions. Solid. Okay, so now we're going to dive into a little bit of economics. We'll talk a little bit about game theory. Okay, so economic incentives. This should be sort of a relatively straightforward topic. You can have tokens and privileges. The way we're going to break that down, specifically in Bitcoin, is tokens are units of a protocol-defined cryptocurrency given out to miners, which you can think of as like block rewards. So that's a tangible reward, and the idea is that like I can give you this reward and encourage you to perform some sort of action. The alternative is a privilege. So that's a decision-making right that's allowing my miner to charge for the transactions. So the idea is behind that would be transaction fees. So the difference between the two is essentially like the difference between me rewarding you some Bitcoin and me giving you some badge that allows you to charge other people. Does that make sense? Thumbs up? Thumbs down if not. Okay, cool. So again, yeah, the general idea is just behind teaching a man to fish versus giving him a fish. Okay. So the two schools of thought in general, economic incentives, everyone I think, or I hope, knows about the carrot and the stick mentality. So you could either increase token balances and privileges when people do things that you would like them to do, or you can reduce and you can slash their allowances if they perform badly, right? That should be pretty general. Anybody has questions about that? No? So we're just incentivizing behavior that we like. Okay, so I'd like you guys to turn to your partners and talk about what exactly most miners are incentivized by. So what do you think? I mean, like, it's really easy to say transaction fees, or like a miner is incentivized by block reward, but like talk further than that. Talk about like if I were running a mining rig, what exactly are my costs? What am I like looking to gain, etc. Okay, discuss. You have like 30 seconds. Okay, I'm gonna bring it back. Did anybody have anything that like their partner brought up that was wildly like superior to any idea I've ever heard? Okay, how about any like ideas that just people heard? Nobody wants to talk? Go for it.
What I know of people who are mining, the autonomous part is only from the miner. So the rest of us who buy them through exchanges, use our credit cards, we use our bank accounts. So it's traceable back to us. But the miners, if you were interested in various things in the world, you would be a miner. Also, miners have got 51% of the power. They're the generals in your Byzantine Empire, right? They collectively do things that changes hard forks and things. So it can be in their selfish best interest to do things. So there's all kinds of power being applied.
Right, okay. So for people who maybe didn't hear that, the idea is that miners have a significant amount of power in the system. They sort of validate transactions, but more than that, they also make decisions, and they decide whether or not to ratify to hard forks or soft forks and things like that. And they collectively have a large say in where the blockchain space goes. Okay, anybody else have a comment? Go for it. All right, go on, sorry.
Well, we brought up an interesting question. Is, you know, the big miners, the mining rigs, say in China, how long do they typically keep Bitcoin? Do they just sell it off right away or not? You know, so the reason this was brought up is because appreciation of the Bitcoin is obviously another huge incentive. Like, if they mine, basically collect a bunch of Bitcoin and
Yeah.
appreciates.
That's actually that's a very valid concern. So his comment was that whether or not miners mine the coin and then do they hold on to it or do they sort of immediately sell it? And is it in their best interest to hold on to it because of the appreciating value, or is it in their best interest to sell immediately? Right? That was your comment? Yeah. So that's actually an interesting comment, and I've heard both sides. I've heard miners people who run large mining rigs say, like, oh, I just sell immediately because who knows when the price is going to go up and down, and really it's in my best interest to just sell immediately because I know that there's some profit margin that I'm set with, and if I don't sell immediately, it might depreciate the next day, and then it's really just up to I don't really want to do the cryptocurrency trading game. I just have a set costs and profit and etc. So it does come back to, a lot of the time, it comes back to this profit equation, right? Profit is equal to my sales minus my cost. And so it's really up to the specific miner, but it's good that we're asking these questions. So if we keep going, I'd like to talk about two things. So the first thing is something called crypto-economic security margin. The idea is that I will have some amount of money, X, such that either some guarantee, G, is satisfied, or those violating G are poorer by at least X. So I need some sort of margin in order for people to be incentivized to do something. If they don't do something, then they're going to be poorer by X, but I at least need X in order to incentivize them in that direction. Does that make sense? So the purpose of this picture is to have people decide whether or not they're going to lose that amount X, the money flying away, or they're going to listen to my terms and conditions and they're going to act accordingly. Does that sort of make sense? Okay, and then there's something called a crypto-economic proof, which is associated with that. And the idea is just messages are signed by the actor. Messages that are signed by the actor are interpreted by everybody else as either some proposal P is true, or the miner agrees to suffer that economic loss. And so this way we can understand that every action taken by some given miner would be some sort of agreement to, everybody understands this agreement, and anytime I take an action, I understand the full consequences of me not taking a certain action. That make sense? Cool. Okay. Yeah, so this is an uncoordinated choice model. Has anybody heard of coordinated, uncoordinated choice models? Okay, so it comes up in biology, surprisingly, and it doesn't come up, that phrase exactly doesn't come up in economics so much. But uncoordinated choice models are essentially Nash equilibrium. Do people know that? Okay, so that's a non-cooperative game. Everyone knows all the other equilibrium strategies, and no one has anything to gain by changing only their own strategy. So let's say Brian and I are playing a game. I know exactly what his incentives are. I know what he's looking at, and he knows what I'm looking at, but neither of us are benefited by changing our strategy at all. Does that make sense? Okay. Oh, that was a joke. Coordinated actors, uncoordinated actors, haha. Never mind. Okay, so let's talk about this, this example. So this was by Rousseau, who came up with this a long, long time ago. But the story is, if I have gone on a hunt with 7 of my hunting buddies, not specifically into hunting, but we're on a hunt, and we have a reasonably high chance of hunting this stag. And we're pretty confident that the stag is going to come by. We set up our trap, but several days go by, and we're pretty hungry. We haven't eaten in several days. And so now a hare comes by, like a little rabbit comes by. So the question becomes, do we all cooperate? Because if we cooperate, then we get the stag, and we have a pretty reasonable chance of getting the stag, and everybody gets a big meal. However, if one of my friends attacks the rabbit, that's one big meal for the person who ate the rabbit, and everybody else gets nothing. And then if we both attack the rabbit, everyone gets a small meal, and no one starves. But there's a twofold risk in this case. So first of all, we risk the stag never showing up, and second of all, we risk another hunter taking the kill first. Does everybody understand the premise of the situation? Okay, so if we look at the table that we presented here, does this make sense to everybody? Let's say I'm the little yellow one over here. If I cooperate with my friend over there, then we both get a profit of 3. If I cooperate and he defects and tries to go after the rabbit, well, he gets the rabbit and I get nothing. But then if I defect and my friend doesn't, then I get the rabbit, which is good for me, but my friend doesn't get anything. And then this in the bottom right-hand corner, if we both attack the rabbit, then we're both like mediumly happy. Does that make sense? Any questions about this? Okay, so now I'd like to relate this to our talk of economic incentives. So if we present, remember how we talked about security margins and X? So if we present an expected punishment for defecting, we can turn this into the prisoner's dilemma problem, if you've heard of that. So our security margin X needs to be greater than all of these individual incentives, because I want to make sure, like my friend and I need to agree that neither of us is going to defect. And in order to trust that nobody else defects, I need some sort of profit margin X in this scenario, such that then we both agree that it is in our best interest to cooperate. That way it's best for both of us. Does that make sense? Okay, anybody has questions? Have questions? No? Okay, so another point I'd like to make is that when anybody is deciding whether or not to defect, they'll expect all the others to be looking at this very same graph. And so therefore they understand that the best option for everybody is if we all wait. Does that make sense? Because again, this is an uncoordinated model, everyone sort of has knowledge of everybody else's table. We're all aware of the same table that we're looking at, and we know the table is the same for everybody. So it's in all of our best interests to wait, and I can trust that everybody else will wait because it's in our best interests. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Let's keep going. So then the alternative to this, the natural following, would be coordinated choice model. So in this case, a model that assumes that all actors in a protocol are controlled by the same agent. So they have the same, they want the same things. So for example, in this scenario, we have a woman and a man, and they're trying to decide where to go on a date. And so if the man wants to go boxing, if the woman goes boxing, she's less happy, right? She gets a 1. But if the man goes boxing and the woman goes shopping, then there's no date, which is a lose-lose situation. Again, if the man goes shopping and the woman goes boxing, well, then they're just both unhappy. And then if the man goes shopping and the woman goes shopping as well, they spend time together, but again, one of them is happier than the other. So in this sort of model, we see that they're going to make one of those two choices, right? They're either going to go boxing or shopping, and it's up to them to battle it out. But the alternative is no date. And so there's only one logical conclusion if they have to work together. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about Vitalik Schelling coin. This is just sort of a thought problem that he came up with for cryptoeconomics, for explaining cryptoeconomics. So first of all, let's say Brian doesn't have an opinion on which way the toilet paper roll should go, and I think he's wrong. I think he should have an opinion, so I suggest that we poll you guys. So if you think A is correct, will you raise your hand? Thank God, all right. And then how about B? Any trolls? All right, fine. Okay, so let's say the answer is A, because A is right. Okay, so now I'm going to say everybody is a censor oracle. Okay, we remember what those are? Yeah? Yes, okay. So if everyone is a censor oracle, and every oracle has to vote either A or B, if you vote with the majority, you get a reward. If you vote wrong, then you don't get anything. And that's how we incentivize our oracles, yes? Everyone remember that? Okay, so the interesting question is, what exactly is the table that we have facing our little guy over here? Like, what exactly is what is the coordinated, uncoordinated choice model table that he's looking at? So, oh, right, sorry. Does anybody have any questions about this? No?
Why did everybody choose A?
Did you choose B? We can talk about this later. Okay. All right, cool. But anybody have any questions about the premise of the problem? No questions? Okay. Can anybody answer whether or not this is an uncoordinated or coordinated choice model? Nobody has an answer? Uncoordinated or coordinated choice model? I'm going to pick on someone. All right, go.
It's uncoordinated.
Uncoordinated, right. Why is that?
Because he has
Mm-hmm.
so he doesn't. His choice is independent. Or it is the reward.
So he's going to vote whatever is in his best interest
Yeah.
based on what he expects everybody else to vote, right? And he presumably can see everybody else's choice table. So it's uncoordinated because you have the incentive to vote truth, and the Nash equilibrium assumes everyone else will vote truth too because it's in their best interests, right? Yes? Makes sense. Okay, uncoordinated, moving on. Okay, so now let's talk about the choice model that we're looking at. So the uncoordinated game is this. If others vote A and you vote A, remember you get some value P and you lose otherwise, and if you vote B and others vote B, then you get some reward. This should make sense. The left-hand side should make sense, yes? Okay, so let's say Nadir is voting, and he saw that the majority was A, right? Because it was. But Brian really, really wants him to answer B for some reason. So if Brian bribes Nadir conditionally, and he says, Nadir, my friend, you only get paid P plus epsilon. I'm willing to give you some epsilon if you vote for B and everyone else votes A. If you vote for B and everyone else also votes for B, you don't get anything. But if you vote for B and everyone else is voting the other way, then I will pay you some P plus epsilon. Does that make sense? Brian is bribing Nadir. Anybody have any questions about this before we go on? Go.
I mean, we know the others are going to vote A, so why would it's not P plus epsilon, it's just epsilon.
I'm sorry?
For Nadir, like his vote, his reward would not be P plus epsilon.
Brian is offering to pay him P plus epsilon.
Oh, he's offering to pay
Yeah,
P plus epsilon.
Exactly,
Epsilon.
exactly. So Nadir has something to gain there, right? He wants to choose that. This changes our attack model. It changes his attack model, it changes his choice diagram. But then the trick here, before we go on, any other questions about this? We understand the premise of the bribing attack model? Okay. Then the trick here is not only does Brian offer this deal to Nadir, but he offers it to everybody. But he doesn't tell everybody that he's offering it to everybody. So everyone is secretly looking at that model. Does that make sense? Okay, and if everybody is secretly looking at this model, what do you think happens? Anybody have an answer? Go for it. Exactly, so if everybody ends up voting for B, then what is the problem here?
Everyone just gets B reward.
Exactly, so everybody gets P reward, and effectively Brian has changed the outcome of this voting model without having spent any money, because he doesn't have to pay out any P plus epsilons, right? Does that make sense to everybody? So this is a dangerous situation, right? Like, we want to make sure that this never happens, because otherwise it's in everyone's best incentive to bribe everybody, right? Does that make sense? Okay. All right, we accept the enormity of this. All right, cool. Okay, so yeah, secret deals. Brian tells everyone that, Brian offers the same deal to everybody, and no one knows that Brian has offered the same deal to everybody, so the dream of money, the dream of epsilon, P plus epsilon is gone. Okay. All right, so let's go on to attacks, and we're going to talk a little bit about going over the attacks that we talked about last lecture. Okay, so how many people remember the term feather forking? Raise your hand. Ooh, okay. So feather forking is the idea that, let's say I am a huge mining pool, and I'm going to say, I'm going to attempt to fork every time you see Gary Johnson. You see Gary Johnson put out any sort of transaction, but I will give up after a while. So as opposed to attempting to fork forever, this doesn't work if I don't have more than 51%, right? So I'm going to be like a big mining pool. And I'm going to give up after the block containing Gary's transaction contains K confirmations. This makes sense to everybody? Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about the choice table that faces every miner in this situation. So I think this is something that you guys talked about last lecture as well, but we're just going to go over it again. So if we let Q equal the proportion of mining power that I have as sort of a big mining entity, see it's somewhere between 0 and 1 probability, and then K is equal to 1. So I will give up after 1 confirmation, that is 1 additional block, and my chance of successfully orphaning the block containing Johnson's transaction is Q squared. Does this make sense? People look confused. I started throwing around math and people got confused. Surprise. Okay. Any questions? Okay. So if I suppose that Q is 20%, that's the 0.2 up there, that is that if I have a mining pool out there that has 20% of the hash rate, then Q squared is going to be 4% chance, and I'm going to suppose that I have 4% chance of orphaning a block, which is not very good just by itself, right? So something to note at this point is other agents are aware that if they include Johnson's transaction, there's going to be a slight chance that their block that they spent so long building could be orphaned, right? And so if I'm a miner looking at this situation, I might be slightly disincentivized to publish the block and include Johnson's transaction into my block because I spent all this hard work computing the block, and there's a chance it could, like that 20% of the network is just flat out going to reject it, right? I don't want to waste my hard work. Does that make sense? Yeah. Go for it.
How is K related to the whole Q squared
K. Okay, go Brian.
So the K is it's related as in it's after how many blocks that the honest majority mines, and then you start giving up. Because in this situation, you're basically saying, I don't have as much computing power as, let's say, like over 51%, right? You have this some like measly amount, 20%, but so you're not guaranteed the chance to always mine the next subsequent block. So you're saying that, okay, after some certain point, I'll want to give up because it will end up taking too much time or too much work, and it'll be like a really low probability. So if we remember from like the analogy I used last time, we have two M&M bowls, right? You put one poisoned M&M inside one of the bowls. So the chances that like as in this situation, you're gonna want to eat from the bowl without the poisoned M&M because you have this probability that the M&M that you picked from the first one will have like a poisoned M&M, and you might end up like going to the hospital. But it's similar to like this model where like you can either choose to include Gary Johnson's block and include like or his transaction in a block, or you can just not include his transaction in a block. In either situation, the first situation is if you include his transaction, you have this chance of not getting your block reward. The second chance is, or the second scenario is, if you don't include his transaction and you just comply with this like mining pool that's saying that they're attempting to fork his transaction, you have a chance of like, or you have a like 100% like probability of getting the mining reward if you mine this block.
Okay.
Like you won't have this lost chance of getting your block.
Okay. Yes, go on. Is it true?
Practical question, just
Okay.
to understand how these node operators communicate with one another. So one of them wants to issue this threat if you mine the Gary transaction, then
Sure.
there's a fork. So how do they pick up the phone? Do they buy emails?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I
Yeah.
mean, they're all across the world, right?
That's
so
a good
question. All of them. So how do you do that?
So there are various modes of communication, but largely the way that miners especially are involved in the community, they follow specific Reddit threads, they follow people on Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is why we were telling you guys to pick up on social media, because a surprising amount of things happen just because of things people hear over social media, over the grapevine. And so if some large mining pool comes out or goes to the newspaper and is like, hey, I have a story for you. I am going to block any transactions, including Gary Johnson. Well, all the miners are going to pick up on that. And it doesn't really matter how you get it out there. It's up to the miner to make sure that they're up to date on any updates like that. Does that make sense? Cool. All right. So let's go on. Does anybody have any last questions about feather forking? The premise is basically that I have, I'm this big entity, I have some say in the network, and I don't like this one person, so I'm just going to block them out, and I'm going to censor anything that they try to send. That should make sense? Yes. All right. So this is the sort of table that we're looking at. Johnson therefore has, he puts out a transaction fee. This is a variable transaction fee. If you were Gary Johnson and you were looking at this table, you're trying to figure out how to make sure that it's worth it for miners to include your transaction, because you don't like the fact that you've been censored, right? So I need to figure out what the lowest minimum transaction fee that I have to attach to my transaction in order to get my money sent or something like that. So 1 minus q squared times the block reward is what the miner is looking at. This is the miner's choice table. If my block is accepted and I'm a miner, then, and I include Gary Johnson's transaction, I get Johnson's transaction fee, I get the block reward, and I get 1 minus q squared, which is the probability that I get the block reward. That makes sense? Given that like Q was, what did we say before? Q was 4%, the 4% chance that my block disappears. On the other hand, if I don't include it, I'm guaranteed block reward. That should make sense? Top two columns make sense to everybody, yes? Cool, all right. And then if my block is rejected and I include it, I get 0 automatically. And if I don't include it and my block is rejected, I get some value P. Let's not talk about P. But so looking at this, and if you do some math, the essential takeaway from this is that Johnson needs to pay a much higher fee for his transaction to remain incentive compatible. In fact, the block reward is right now at 12.5 Bitcoin. So that means that multiplied by approximately 4%, we arrive at 0.5 Bitcoin as his transaction fee. If you've been following the price of Bitcoin, that's quite a lot of money. That's around like maybe $4,000. And just an FYI, BTC.com operates with 25.1% of the network hash rate. So remember that here we proposed, oops, the spray coming up. So remember here we proposed that Q would be 0.2%. So I only have 20% of the hash rate. But we know that BTC.com operates with about 25.1% of the hash rate. Go for it.
Sorry, again, a practical question.
You're fine.
Is this a theoretical discussion or has this already happened?
Yeah, so this is actually, this is just basic crypto economics, explaining why miners are incentivized to do what they do and why we have set, when you're designing a new blockchain, for instance, these are all the things that you really need to consider because you want to make sure that your miners act the way you want them to. And so if your question is more that, do we know if BTC.com has censored somebody? Well, the answer is no, right? We don't know that they've successfully censored somebody. No one mining pool is going to come out and be like, it's bad press. You're not going to come out and be like, oh, we really hate this person. We're just not going to. Yeah, but the reality is, if they wanted to, it's very possible that they could. Yeah.
As someone whose Bitcoin wallet might have been potentially censored, how would you find out that that was the case?
How would you find out that it had been censored?
Yeah. The transaction would just never go through because the amount that you're going on to pay the mining fees wouldn't be high enough. But I already know that.
Right. So it's also possible that it's not just being censored. It's just that your transaction fee wasn't high enough. And so that's a concern that a lot of people have. They're saying, well, as the amount of transactions that people try to throw onto the network goes up, well, then there are just a lot more transactions in the transaction pool that miners are looking at, and they're more incentivized to take the ones that offer them higher transactions. And then the problem becomes, well, then it just becomes prohibitively expensive for anybody to send a transaction. So that's something that Brian is going to address in the next part of the lecture. But the main point and the main takeaway from this part is we've just shown how with 20% of the network hash rate, we can make it prohibitively expensive for someone to participate in the Bitcoin network. And that's something that you guys should keep in mind moving forward, because the game theory behind this has some tricky implications. But yeah, okay, any questions? If not, yeah.
What is the actual Q for, I thought it was 6, right? In the previous lecture, I remember, you said after 6 confirmation, 6 blocks, that's when.
Okay, yeah, that's something that we can talk about. I'm just gonna put everybody on break so everyone can have a break. But if you have a question, you can come up to talk to me after, right now. Do you need this?
No, I'm good. But I think the feather forking aspect was if you're no, you did it properly. It's just that it makes sense after you talk about punitive forking, because I talked about last lecture.
Yeah, I saw. I just didn't take it.
Punitive forking is basically if you have over 50%, this is how you
that's where that came from.
Yeah, but then but yeah, feather forking is if you lose some sort of percentage, how do you still try to censor even though you have less?
Okay,
yeah.
That's my bad. I forgot.
It's fine. It's fine.
Okay.
But then I just used the analogy of 2 M&M bowls because that's what Noah did. He was like, you have 2 M&M bowls. Which one do you eat from, considering one has a frozen M&M? Yeah. Do you have any experience there's in developing a little bit. Yeah, I wanted to ask something probably.
So what I'm saying
Okay, after, yeah.
we just
Can you
showed
after?
in theory. We showed that
I mean, okay, if one side means the other is already
So the reason why
so that's something that like you need to
also, also in the case that others.
but
Yeah, but that is because why it's fair. I mean, I just
say, oh, well, like the idea, general premise is very attractive.
yeah, but
But dangerous. Exactly. Dangerous.
why? What about the general premise? I mean, maybe for the trying to walk because we have also it's only one my one, which is probably the
no, so if you come up with and you want to
oh, you have to convert it by another block. So you need one more. Okay. So it is q to the power k plus 1. Okay.
it gets smaller.
Okay. It's really like temporary.
Yeah.
So I mean,
those are.
if you really want to block someone, you have to keep doing it.
Yeah. And then, yeah, you have to keep doing this, but the idea is that if you it's probable instead of being smaller, try it. One it's because you have you originally start off with a but like since you're someone you actually use power, but you still have trying to this person better less. We won't know that.
On the first question, the matrix.
I'm not
kind of reduces
Oh, shit. Okay.
Okay, guys, we're gonna resume our lecture and start talking about proof of stake. A lot of our quiz questions were pulled from the proof of stake section from the Bitcoin textbook, but okay. So we're here to talk about proof of stake, your second real consensus mechanism or protocol after proof of work. Gillian talked a lot about the economics and why people do things. Why people do the things they do, right? And so I'm here to say that in proof of stake, a lot of the mechanisms or the way it works, it really relies on a lot of basic economics and how people interpret incentives. So before we get started, I want to pose this quick question to y'all. What are some of the drawbacks that you have in proof of work? Anybody have an answer? Yeah.
It consumes a lot of energy.
Exactly, right? That's the main caveat or the main pain point that people talk about. Does anyone have another answer? Okay, we got one. So yeah, it's very energy inefficient. You have a lot of people doing, I guess, SHA-256 on just one thing, right? To an outsider, it seems like a really bad waste of energy. But to a participant in the Bitcoin network, it's actually how they maintain security, right? Also, another drawback of proof of work is that it also encourages the creation of ASICs because you have to continue mining. It might be better off to create these ASICs that are just used for the sole purpose of mining this particular cryptocurrency or these certain cryptocurrencies, right? But that's not good because out of the scope of mining, these ASICs have no real use. And lastly, I want to talk about this idea of a defender's advantage. So what I mean by this is, let's say I'm playing a game with Gillian, and we both have these two options of either attacking or defending. Having the defender's advantage means that it's more favorable to be on the defending side. Has anybody played the game Risk? So the example I want to bring up is, let's say you're battling a person one-on-one, right? So you have an attacker and a defender. In Risk, you have a defender's advantage because if you're, at least when you're battling one-on-one, because if you roll the dice, if you ever tie with someone, you end up winning as the defender, right? So the defender has the advantage in the case of a tie. So currently in proof of work, there's no sense of a defender's advantage. The cost of an attack and the cost of the defense is some sort of 1-to-1 ratio, and that's because we're dealing with these inflexible constraints because we're dealing with physical, real-world constraints such as electricity and computing power, and it isn't more or less favorable to either attack or defend. And in this situation, there's really nothing to discourage bad behavior, and proof of work just simply allows it. It just says that if you're able to amass more than enough resources than a defender, you cripple the system basically. And that's why we transition into this idea of proof of stake. So in proof of stake, we're able to design these better systems that allow us to, I guess, specify properties that we want to maintain a defender's advantage. So a few examples, you can introduce penalties, or you can try to punish bad behavior much more greatly than it does in proof of work. Actually, in proof of work, you don't punish any bad behavior. So this security, this one-line philosophy that Vitalik states is that rather than having security come from burning electricity in proof of work, the security in proof of stake comes from putting up economic value at loss. So we actually try to discourage bad behavior by explicitly stating the consequences that you might have if you try to do a malicious attack or something like that. In proof of work, there's no such thing. The consequences are kind of implicit. Does that make any sense? Any questions? So that's the main motivations why we transitioned into proof of stake. First of all, it's kind of proof of work is a little bit inefficient, and second of all, proof of stake has ways to discourage bad behavior. So So we talk about proof of stake. So what is actually proof of stake? So it's a category of consensus algorithms. There's many ways to actually implement proof of stake, but it's a consensus algorithm that depends on an individual's like economic stake in the network, whether that be like tokens in that network or it be the digital assets that you're actually dealing with. Participants are actually given the right to add new blocks to the blockchain based on how much stake they have in the network, so based on their voting power. So some examples of, I guess, protocols or cryptocurrencies that try to use proof of stake is one, Casper. They're trying to do like a proof of work, proof of stake hybrid. Tendermint is a proof of stake implementation that, it's a proof of stake implementation. Purecoin is the first cryptocurrency or altcoin to try to implement proof of stake. NXT and Blackcoin are another few examples. So moving on. So if we recall from proof of work, we have these miners where their voting power is actually tied to the proportion of computational power they have in the network. These guys race to solve this cryptographic hash puzzle that help validate transactions in the network, and by doing so, these miners are rewarded for doing their work. In proof of stake, we don't have miners, we have these validators who are stakeholders in the network, and they have voting power that's really proportional to the amount of economic stake they have in the network or how much they lock up depending on which type of like proof of stake implementation you're using. So in proof of stake, there's no mining. People call this like, I guess, like voting process or virtual mining because instead of actual mining, you have these validators propose what should be the next block in the blockchain and without having to do some sort of like computational work to verify transactions and whatnot. So a few more differences. So if we look at proof of work and proof of stake, because like I said, proof of work has this like defender's advantage. We can disincentivize bad behavior. So in proof of work, we don't have this idea of like if you try to act maliciously, you don't get punished for it. But in proof of stake, you can explicitly state in your protocol that you want like either you can slash people's funds. So you can think of it as if you try to conduct a 51% attack, if you're not successful, you burn down your ASIC farm. In proof of work, your rewards are dependent on how much you put into like the mining hardware that you use to mine the cryptocurrency. And in proof of stake, you get rewards based on being selected to propose blocks, and that's dependent on like your proportion of stake in the network. Also, proof of work can also, I guess, introduce this idea of centralization by, I guess, giving hardware like ASIC hardware to like specific individuals like that manufacture them. In proof of stake, because there's no like mining hardware specifically, you can't really have like centralization in that sense. Proof of work because you're not disincentivized to, I guess, collude. You can form cartels that can conduct these bad attacks that we talked about in lecture 6. In proof of stake, because you're, like, I guess, you get punished for acting maliciously. If you try to form a cartel, you might lose out on your money. And also, proof of stake is a little bit more energy efficient because instead of just running a computer that constantly mines, you're running a computer to verify transactions and propose blocks to the system. Any questions? Yeah.
If you go back on the slide,
Mm-hmm.
The 51% attack is like burning down your ASIC farm if you're unsuccessful.
I guess also the protocol can, if people notice that you're trying to conduct a 51% attack, they see that you have more than 51% of the funds in the network, and you see you're trying to act maliciously, they can always fork off and say that, okay, this bad member of the community, we don't want to do like any business with them, and essentially like the real chain becomes all the honest miners, basically, right? And so the people who mine, or the person who's trying to conduct the 51%, even though if they're successful, people see that and they go like, we don't want to do business with you, so we're cutting you out of this actual like truthful chain. So in that sense, you also lose out on the funds that you staked into the system originally. So it's the analogy is it's like burning down your ASIC farm because you lose out on all your economic stake if you try to act maliciously.
But I guess like if you were successful, then it's like burning down everyone else's ASIC farm, or like the others.
you could state that in that sense, but then I guess the honest miners come together and say, because you try to, I guess, do this bad or malicious activity, we can, I guess, they have a better say in the network because you're one entity and they're like a community of people, and they can come together and say that this person tried to conduct a 51% attack. We don't want this like bad behavior continue to happen, so we'll fork off and we'll say that this person, like in our new version of the blockchain, this person doesn't exist, and this person's funds don't exist. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess like, would it be obvious to know like which was the honest group of people and which wasn't if you were like an independent miner?
Yeah, so you would want to join the honest miners.
So like, how do you know?
How would you know?
Yeah.
I guess this is like a practical answer. If some person tries to do a 51% attack and the community bands together and they try to fork off and they say this is now like the new chain. So like if you have like in the sense of like if you look back in Ethereum, you have Ethereum and Ethereum Classic. Ethereum like Classic is the one that wasn't, I guess, was vulnerable to the DAO hack. But the new chain that everyone uses, the one that everyone still, I guess, does business on, is the normal Ethereum chain that is separate from like Ethereum Classic. So like you can create these forks that people can either adopt or not adopt. It's up to the person, like an individual, to decide which one they want to join. But they'll probably join like the good honest majority, because that's what they want to get involved in. They don't want to get involved with someone who's like 51% of the network. Yeah.
Could you then also be the response to a 51% attack in the proof of work blockchain, that the honest people say, okay, we don't want that, we're going to fork off?
Yeah, you can do that. But I guess in the sense that proof of work doesn't have an explicit way of saying that you get punished for conducting doing bad behavior. In proof of stake, you can explicitly say in the protocol, if you try to do something bad in the network, you get punished for it. This is 51% is just like a threshold, but I'm just saying for all sorts of bad behavior, in proof of stake, you can explicitly state consequences for those bad actions. Okay, I'm going to move on. So there's two basic, I guess, flavors of proof of stake that we talk about. We have a chain-based proof of stake implementation, and in this version, it's very similar to proof of work, except we switch up how we do the selection process. So if we recall from proof of work, whoever gets to mine the next block is the person who solves the cryptographic hash puzzle, right? But in this chain-based proof of stake, we randomly choose a validator from the network, and that's based on their proportional stake invested in the network. And whoever gets chosen, they get to create a block and they add that to the new blockchain. So this chosen validator gets the block reward once they add this new block to the blockchain. So this is, I guess, this naive solution or the chain-based proof of stake, because whoever gets selected always is able to add to the blockchain. Let's say you don't trust this person who's proposing this new block to the system and you want to fork off, or you don't want to actually fork off. How do you prevent, how do you change up your implementation so that you don't have to trust specific people from proposing blocks or becoming validators, right? So we have, if we recall back to like Byzantine, the generals problem, we have this idea of a Byzantine fault-tolerant proof of stake. So if we have dishonest nodes in the network and we don't trust these validators to propose blocks, we can have a way to come to consensus on which blocks are added to the blockchain. So like the previous implementation, we still randomly choose a validator from this group of validators in the network, and this validator gets to propose a block. But the thing is, after they propose a block, all the other validators have to vote on whether or not this block is valid or not. So if not enough people vote on it, or not, they don't get a 2/3 majority on let's say a yes to propose this block or add this block to the blockchain, this block is now orphaned, and we return back to step one. If this block gets I guess approved to become the next block in the blockchain, the validator gets the block reward and the transaction fees associated with it. Do the two implementations make any sense? Yeah. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Can this also be like subject to a blacklisting attack? Like you can have like people say we will never accept a block from like this.
So yes, that is correct. You can do that because these two versions of proof of stake are inherently different. They're very similar, but I guess because you need to come to consensus on which block becomes the next one. If you have enough people that I guess refrain from voting or refuse to vote on this person, yes, you get like you can either blacklist someone or you can even have like the network never come to consensus if I guess not enough people vote. Any other questions? Yeah. So this is a few of the drawbacks that we have with proof of stake. We have this idea of the rich get richer. So because if you have like a higher proportion of the I guess digital assets in the network, you might be able to get chosen more often as a validator to propose a block. So if you have an already large stake in the network, you increase your chances of becoming or increasing the chances of mining blocks and thereby increasing the like assets that you own. Also, because we have this idea of you have to stake down some sort of assets to participate in the voting process, such as being a validator, your funds are actually locked up, meaning that those digital assets are not liquid. So it shouldn't be the fact that if you decide to become a validator in, let's say, a block proposal round, you shouldn't be able to spend the funds that you lock up. So because of this, proof of stake isn't as liquid as you want it to be because you have funds that are locked up. And if you have low participation in a proof of stake network, it causes centralization, meaning that the same people are proposing blocks and validating blocks. And the last part is if some entity sells a private key who existed like very, very long back in the blockchain history, they can actually conduct what's called a long-range attack and rewrite the history of the blockchain, which is bad. I'll talk about that in the next section, which is attacks. Okay. So we're going to address the problem of the nothing at stake problem. So to give you like an analogy of to understand this better, let's say you're taking like a midterm and you get this question on the midterm saying it's going to rain today, true or false, right? And you read the instructions and you realize, okay, they only reward me for answering the correct answer. They don't actually punish me for doing anything. So this is very similar to what proof of work looks like. So if I answer the correct answer, then I get rewarded. Let's say I get a block reward. If I answer the wrong one, I don't get anything at all. So I get like a expected value zero. So if I look at my test, I think my diagram or like my answer table looks like this, where if I answer correctly, I'll get a point on the midterm. If I answer incorrectly, I won't get any points for that question, right? But in reality, my answer diagram actually looks like this. If I don't answer the question, I get no points at all. But because of like this loophole that I found that you only get rewarded for answering the question correctly, if I circle both true and false, I'll get points regardless because one way or another, it's the statement is either true or false, right? So because of this like small loophole, I'm able to, I guess, get points on this midterm for answering, like just circling both answers, right? So that's actually the nothing at stake problem. So let's say I'm a miner or I'm a validator network, and I see this, I see that, okay, the blockchain is going along, and I see that a fork appears. So there's two sides of the fork. I have fork A and fork B. I know that one of the chains will actually live on because one of the blocks won't actually continue to live on in history. One will be orphaned, and the other one will continue and become the next longest chain, right? So because I know only one of these forks will ever live on, what prevents me from mining on or proposing blocks for both forks and trying to reap in the benefits of both? So in either case, I know only one will live on, but I try to maximize my chances of getting my block reward by mining on both sides of the fork. Does that make any sense? So we have this. Nothing at stake problem. Validators know that if they create blocks on multiple competing chains, they'll maximize their chances of getting a reward because only one chain gets to live on. So we have this problem also if this continues on. If everyone tries to, I guess, add blocks to both sides of the fork, the blockchain never converges and you never reach some sort of consensus, and that's really bad too. So we get to this, I guess, naive proof of stake where we have two sides of the fork. If we vote on neither side of the fork, we don't get any expected value. If we vote on the correct chain or the correct side of the fork, we get this expected value of 0.9. If we vote on the wrong chain, we get a lower expected value. But if we vote on both, we get a higher than we do if we vote individually on one, right? And in proof of work, this is actually not possible because we have, this is not possible because if we're trying to mine on both sides of the fork, we have to distribute our computing power evenly amongst both sides of the fork because mining a block in proof of work requires some sort of computational work or time-sensitive operation that allow you to create blocks. In proof of stake, it's no longer dependent on computational power or any time-sensitive mechanism, and that becomes a problem because it's easy to create blocks for the new system. So in proof of work, you can't conduct a nothing at stake attack, but in proof of stake, we can actually do something like this. So this is how we defend against this. We introduce this idea of slashing. So we make a rule that says we're only allowed to vote on one side of the fork. So far, we've only explored the ideas of rewards in the system. In proof of work, you either get a block reward or you don't. But in proof of stake, let's introduce these penalties, right? We have these two possibilities. If you vote on the wrong side of the fork, you get punished. Or if you're caught voting on multiple forks, you get punished too. So what this looks like is, if you vote on neither, you don't get any sort of expected value. If you vote on the correct one, you'll actually get this expected value, the correct expected value, which is 0.9. If you vote on the wrong side of the block, instead of just getting the expected value from that wrong side of the chain, you get punished for that and you get a negative expected value. And if you vote on both, it sees the protocol sees that you voted on both, and you get slashed for for voting on both sides of the chain. So in either case, the slashing mechanism disincentivizes people from trying to act maliciously and trying to conduct a nothing at stake attack. So if we look back at our analogy, right? If let's say the graders realize that they have this problem with your midterm, and they say, okay, we'll try to fix that by conducting slashing or implementing slashing. So if I answer answer this true or false question wrong, I'll get -1 on my for this question, right? And if I answer both true or false, then I'll also get a negative point value. Yeah.
What if you don't know the answer to the question? In the context of mining,
yeah.
If you don't know what the right vote is, and the best move in that situation would be not to vote, doesn't that kind of disincentivize the act of mining?
So that's a very good question, actually. I am actually not sure which side of in let's say in an ideal world where everyone is altruistic, and you happen to just have a fork because two blocks are composed at the same time. I'm actually not sure which side of the fork you'll actually try to continue on. That just means that one side of the fork will actually just get orphaned. But the idea is to prevent anyone from trying to maximize their profits by mining on both sides of the chain. I'm not actually sure what's the exact way you'll determine which side of the fork you want to go with, but you're hoping that the one that you do add a block to will end up being your longest chain, right? Yeah.
How is the penalty implemented in practice in the slashing mechanism? Because we so far heard with Bitcoin, to send money, you need two keys and you then transact the money. But in the other direction, to prove the money, is this done through a smart contract, or how does this work?
So So this slashing mechanism is like, it's at a high level, this is how it works. How it's implemented is it's a little bit different, and it's up to whatever protocol is implementing it. So like I said, proof of stake has many, it's a general idea. There's many ways to implement it. That's why you get a lot of different proof of stake implementations. So it's dependent on whoever is implementing the protocol to decide how they want to implement this like slashing mechanism. You can do something where the person who tries to vote on both sides of the chain end up getting their funds slashed to propose in like or the validator who tries to propose blocks on both sides of the chain, they'll get their funds, like they'll lose all their funds that they lock up in the voting round. So that's one way to do it. But I'm not exactly sure like the specific way that either Casper does it or Tendermint does it. Yeah. Yeah.
Why is disincentivizing answering and choosing the wrong block necessary if I'm disincentivizing voting twice? Already prevents the nothing at stake.
Oh, I mean, the idea was that how do I actually like implement a rule that punishes you? You can either detect if someone votes wrongly or detect if someone votes on both. So
Either or.
yeah. Yeah, so these are two ways that you can actually implement it. You either do the wrong chain, or if they vote on both chains. So you either have to go with one or the other. You can't do both. Yeah. Any question? Any other further questions? Yeah.
Yeah, in the same way that you can block people's transactions, like if you're the miner who's like proposing the block, could you block people's votes? Like is that a potential thing?
It depends on your implementation actually, because if you're looking solely at like just naive chain-based proof of stake, you know that the validator who gets chosen and to get to propose a block, they'll always be able to add a block to the blockchain because of how naive chain-based proof of stake works. If we're dealing with the BFT style proof of stake, because if the person who gets chosen as a validator isn't guaranteed that their block will get propagated to the blockchain. Does that make any sense? Because people have to vote on it. So the idea is maybe in a BFT style approach, might be some people who don't want this transaction to go through, and they can actually try to censor this particular validator from proposing any block to the blockchain. So that's, I guess, one way. It really depends on which implementation or style of proof of stake you're actually using. So we also have this idea of a long-range attack. So we have this flawed kind of preconception that the longest chain is the most trustworthy one and therefore the correct one, right? In proof of work, this is kind of acceptable because this longest chain has the most work done on it, meaning that this time-extensive operation has been done to make sure that these blocks, that the longest chain is somewhat provably correct, right? You know that this longest chain had to have some time like associated with it to get to this certain point. But in proof of stake, we don't have any sort of like mining or this aspect of work. So how can we trust like this longest chain is the correct one, right? And that's the whole reason, or that's the main caveat we have with a long-range attack. So suppose Gillian owns like 1% of the tokens immediately after like this Genesis block is created because maybe she participated in the ICO, right? So in this sense, she starts mining her own secret chain, and because creating blocks doesn't really require any work, Gillian's able to like create a longer chain that can outlast the current existing one, even if she waits like 2 years, right? She just like continually mines on her own secret chain, like just incrementally, right? If this new chain gets like accepted as like this truth because it becomes longer than the existing one, she's successfully like overwritten the entire blockchain history, right? The reason why this is called a long-range attack is because you can have like this attack start from any point in time. Basically, you can start from one block back, or it can start from all the way back from like the Genesis block, or 60,000 blocks back, right? This is because, I guess, in proof of work, you can't start that far back because it gets more and more difficult to create these new blocks on top of your secret chain if you do this in proof of stake because there's no like mining or time extensive operation required or associated with mining or creating blocks, then it becomes easier to create blocks and create like this longest chain, right? So that's the main idea behind a long range attack. Instead of actually instead of starting like one block back, you can start very, very far back and overwrite this history of the blockchain, and that's very bad. And I guess the way that you can solve this is either through like this, either one through like the slashing mechanism, where you have a set of validators that I guess you have to identify that you know that these are the good validators. So if you see some person trying to create like this super long chain of that only has them in it, then you know it's kind of like untrustworthy, meaning there's no other participants in this network besides this one person named Gillian, right? So in that case, you can like kind of detect if some like malicious behavior is going wrong or going bad, and you try to, I guess, enforce punishments based on that. Any questions? So next, I'm going to cover stake grinding. So in a proof of stake ecosystem, because we need to select validators to propose blocks, we need the protocol to have some sort of way to randomly select a validator, right? We actually need to pick from like this infinite sequence of validators, because let's say if someone gets selected to be a validator but they're not online, so we have to shift the role onto someone else, and so forth. The case is that if usually a validator will be found within like the first few, but in theory we need some sort of sequence of validators that need to be chosen from if some people aren't online. So in some certain implementations, a chosen validator actually depends on the previous block signature. So someone who's a little bit crafty, right? They can play around with like the signatures in the blocks that they produce, because I guess creating blocks and signatures don't require that much, I guess, computational power anymore. You can play around with creating like these new signatures that might be able to, I guess, turn the probability in your favor that you'll get chosen as the next validator, and so on and so forth. So you kind of fine-tune these special parameters in your signature that, I guess, tries to let you get selected as the next round's validator as well. So that's the idea of stake grinding, to like, I guess, play around with these signatures and play around with different parameters so that you can get chosen next. So the way that you would fix this is, instead of having like mutable parameters in the previous block used, you can try to differentiate that and use something else to, I guess, introduce randomness. Also, you can have validators deposit their stake well in advance, meaning that if you weren't expecting to be a validator in this next round, you shouldn't be able to like be a validator, right? And also, you can either try to use some sort of secret sharing mechanism that have multiple validators come to consensus on some sort of random value that will create a new validator in the next round. So unless we have a majority that really colludes together and creates this this collusion for a random value, this is relatively a safe scheme. Any other further questions? And so I guess a little bit after these attacks, like what a 51% like equivalent attack would look like is, if you have more than like 51% of like the network stake, you can try to even like overwrite the history of the blockchain, right? I said that in the long range attack you can do that even with like a low amount of percentage in the tokens, but if you have even more, I guess, percentage or proportion of the network stake at hand, you can, I guess, try to overwrite the history of the blockchain and write conflicting histories that the honest minority might not agree with. Or two, you can either do something where you can have a situation where people can't come to consensus on like a given state, and they'll always be stuck in this loop of trying to agree on what is the correct version of the blockchain. So those are like really like equivalent attacks that you might try to do on like a proof of stake network. And yeah, Does anybody have any further questions? Does anybody understand why, I guess, proof of stake has its roots in crypto economics, right? Why we introduced crypto economics this whole lecture, and we talked about proof of stake afterwards. Yeah.
How is the stake quantified? Do you know how much stake?
So I guess the stake in the network is, I guess, quantified by your cryptocurrency that you own in this network, or the tokens that you own in this network. So let's say we have Ethereum that we're working with, which is entirely purely proof of stake, right? Let's say you have 30% of the tokens in Ethereum, right? So in a naive proof of stake implementation, this proof of stake implementation will choose you to become a validator 30% of the time, basically, based on how much tokens you have in this network, right? And the idea is that this gets rid of the mining aspect, but it still ties your voting power to some sort of resource. So in proof of work, we tie our external resource, or we tie our voting power to computational power. In proof of stake, we tie our voting power to the proportion of stake that we have in the network. Does that make any sense? And actual proof of stake implementations, rather than having all your stake used as I guess your proportion of voting power, you actually lock up your funds or lock up a certain number of tokens in a voting round to become validators in, let's say, this specific voting round. So let's say you have 30% of the tokens, but you put in a certain number of tokens to participate in this voting round. In this case, whoever wants to participate in this voting round to create this next block, your voting power comes from the percentage of tokens that are locked up in this voting round. Does that make any sense? Yeah. And that's it for today. We have readings for I guess this is to I guess guide you into our next lecture, which is on alternate consensus, alternate forms of consensus. So we have an article on different alternatives to proof of work. We have Stellar's version of consensus, which is I guess I forget what it's called, but yeah. So and then there's also these two videos one video that we want you to watch, and an overview of what Raft is. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks for the lecture. Can you explain the solution for stake grinding again?
Stake grinding. So stake grinding is the idea that you're just trying to fine tune parameters so that you get rid of as much randomness to become the next proposer or validator. So instead of one way that you get rid of all the parameters that you can play around with to become this next validator. So you get rid of all these controllable variables that you can play around with. Or two, you can have people stake their they can lock up their stake well in advance, so that let's say if they weren't expecting to be a validator in this particular voting round, because you kind of forge this next you kind of forced this next round where you got selected. If you weren't, I guess, expecting to become a validator, then you shouldn't become a validator. So it's you have to expect to be chosen, somehow be chosen in this voting round to participate in this voting round. So that's the idea of staking your thing well in advance. And the third option is either you have whoever's voting in this voting round, they come to consensus around some sort of a random value to select amongst them. So rather than, it's a little bit kind of technical.
Yeah, is there something for this solution? It just seems like
if you
a
really
very difficult thing to find a solution to.
So yeah, it is actually.
Because one person could pretend to be many people, and if so the thing that selects the next validator the randomness, I guess, comes from the transactions and all the stuff that gets
Yeah.
included in the block.
Yeah.
So like the person who's doing that they could play around with what transaction or something gets included, and it seems like there's an infinite number of things they can do.
Yeah, they can play around with a lot of things, but then you try to minimize the number of things that they can play around and modify so that they will that gets really detailed.
But let's say if they have let's say 30% of stake, or like a decent percentage,
Yeah.
and they have enough computing power to play around with all these things, like how would you even detect that someone's done it?
It becomes hard. And so you said something around someone has multiplied and you said that they're trying to address, they participate in this mining pool round or the voting round. The idea behind